The gleaming halls of JFK International Airport buzzed with their usual frenetic energy on that crisp autumn morning. Sarah Johnson, dressed in comfortable jeans and a simple black sweater, wheeled her carry-on through Terminal 4, purposefully blending into the crowd. Few would guess that this 35-year-old black woman was actually a newly appointed board member of Atlantic Airways, one of the country's largest airlines. Sarah had spent 15 years climbing the corporate ladder, earning her MBA from Harvard, and breaking barriers in the aviation industry. Now, as part of her role on the board, she was conducting an undercover assessment of the airline's customer service, something she insisted on doing personally, despite her colleagues' protests. Gate B23, right on time, Sarah muttered to herself, checking her first-class ticket. She'd deliberately booked this route, known for its high-profile business travelers, to evaluate the airline's premium service offerings. As she approached the gate, she noticed the subtle shifts in other passengers' gazes, the quick glances, the slight double takes. She was used to it. Being a black woman in predominantly white spaces came with its own unspoken screenplay. The boarding process began smoothly enough. Sarah waited patiently in the first-class line, observing the gate agent's interactions with other passengers. When it was her turn, the gate agent's smile flickered just slightly as she scanned Sarah's ticket, but maintained professional courtesy. "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Johnson," the agent said, though her tone carried a hint of doubt that Sarah had long learned to recognize. As Sarah made her way down the jet bridge, she mentally noted the interaction for her report. The subtle microaggressions were exactly what she was looking for, the small moments that could make or break a passenger's experience. The first-class cabin gleamed with its usual luxury, wide leather seats, chrome accents, and the soft mood lighting that Atlantic Airways was known for. Sarah stored her carry-on and settled into 2A, her favorite window seat. Around her, business executives in tailored suits tapped away on laptops or chatted in hushed tones about upcoming meetings. That's when Karen Miller entered the cabin. The lead flight attendant, with her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and crisp uniform, began her pre-flight checks. Sarah watched as Karen warmly greeted other first-class passengers, offering them pre-departure champagne with practiced grace. When she reached Sarah's row, however, the warmth evaporated. "Excuse me," Karen said, her voice carrying a sharp edge. "Could I see your boarding pass?" Sarah calmly produced her ticket, though she noted how Karen hadn't asked to see anyone else's. The flight attendant examined it with exaggerated scrutiny. "There seems to be some confusion," Karen announced loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This section is for first-class passengers only." "Yes, I'm aware," Sarah replied evenly. "As you can see from my boarding pass, I'm in the correct seat." Karen's lips tightened into a thin line. "Well, we've had some issues with seat assignments today. I believe there might be more suitable seating available in economy." The implications hung heavy in the air. Several nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others pretended to be absorbed in their phones or magazines. One elderly gentleman in a business suit actually nodded in agreement with Karen. Sarah felt the familiar burn of indignation in her chest, but her expression remained neutral. Years of corporate experience had taught her to handle such situations with grace. "I'm quite comfortable here, thank you," she said firmly. "My ticket clearly shows seat 2A, first class." Karen's smile turned cold. "I need to ensure all passengers are appropriately accommodated. For everyone's comfort and convenience, perhaps you'd be more comfortable in economy. We can offer you a partial refund." The suggestion was clear: you don't belong here. Sarah glanced around the cabin, taking mental notes of every face, every reaction. The young executive across the aisle who looked away in embarrassment. The older woman in 1C who pursed her lips disapprovingly, though whether at Sarah or Karen wasn't clear. The flight attendant's body language. The careful choice of words that maintained a veneer of professionalism while delivering clear discrimination. In that moment, Sarah had a choice. She could reveal her identity as a board member and watch Karen's face drain of color. She could demand to speak to the captain or create a scene that would undoubtedly go viral on social media within hours. Instead, she did something that surprised even herself. Very well, Sarah said quietly, gathering her belongings. I'll move to economy. Karen's triumphant smile made Sarah's decision even more certain. As she walked through the business class cabin toward economy, she could feel the stares of other passengers. Some sympathetic, others satisfied, most simply relieved the uncomfortable situation was over. What Karen and the others didn't see was Sarah discreetly activating her phone's voice recorder, or the careful notes she was taking on her tablet about every detail of the interaction. They didn't know that this moment would become the catalyst for one of the biggest cultural transformations in Atlantic Airways history. As Sarah settled into her new seat in economy, 23B, a middle seat with significantly less legroom, she began composing an email to her fellow board members. The subject line read, "Priority discussion item for next board meeting. Systemic discrimination in customer service." The flight attendant's actions had just guaranteed that the next board meeting would be anything but routine. Sarah smiled slightly to herself, thinking of the changes that were about to come. Sometimes, the most powerful position wasn't in first class, it was in having the authority to ensure such discrimination never happened again. As the plane took off into the cloudy New York sky, Sarah Johnson was already planning how this experience would reshape not just Atlantic Airways, but potentially the entire airline industry's approach to diversity and inclusion. Little did Karen Miller know, her actions that day would become a case study in corporate training programs across the country. But that was still to come. For now, Sarah settled back in her cramped economy seat, opened her laptop, and began to write. The Atlantic Airways boardroom, situated on the 45th floor of their Manhattan headquarters, commanded a spectacular view of the city skyline. But on this particular morning, none of the 12 board members were admiring the view. All eyes were fixed on Sarah Johnson as she stood at the head of the polished mahogany table. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice steady and controlled, "2 weeks ago, I experienced something that I believe requires our immediate attention." She pressed a button on her laptop, and an audio recording filled the room. The board members listened intently as the interaction between Sarah and Karen Miller played out. The recording captured everything: the condescending tone, the subtle implications, the uncomfortable silence of other passengers. When it finished, the room remained deathly quiet. "This isn't just about one flight attendant's behavior," Sarah continued, pulling up a PowerPoint presentation. "This is about a systemic issue within our organization. I've compiled data from our customer satisfaction surveys over the past 5 years, specifically focusing on complaints related to discriminatory treatment." The graphs she displayed showed a disturbing pattern. Complaints of discrimination had been steadily rising, with many incidents going unaddressed or being dismissed as misunderstandings. Marcus Chen, the CEO, leaned forward in his chair. "Sarah, this is disturbing, to say the least. Why weren't these patterns flagged before?" "Because," Sarah replied, "our current reporting system categorizes these incidents as general customer service issues. They are buried under layers of bureaucracy and never properly addressed. But I can assure you, as someone who just experienced it firsthand, these aren't mere service issues." Patricia Reynolds, the longest-serving board member, removed her glasses slowly. "We need to address this immediately. The potential PR nightmare alone." "With all due respect," Sarah interrupted, "I'm not presenting this because of PR concerns. This is about fundamental human dignity and our responsibility as industry leaders." Just then, there was a knock at the boardroom door. Karen Miller entered, having been summoned for what she thought was a routine performance review. The color drained from her face as she recognized Sarah sitting at the board table. "Ms. Miller," Sarah said calmly, "please, have a seat." Karen's legs seemed to barely carry her to the chair. I don't understand," she stammered. 2 weeks ago, on flight AA 1421 from JFK to LAX, you made a decision based on prejudice," Sarah stated. "Today, we're going to discuss that decision and its implications." The next hour was intense. Karen attempted to defend her actions, claiming she was following unofficial protocols for passenger comfort. Each excuse she offered only served to highlight the deeper problems within the company culture. Ms. Miller. Marcus Chen interjected, "You saying these unofficial protocols are common practice?" Karen's silence spoke volumes. Sarah stood again, this time presenting a comprehensive proposal. "I've developed a 5-point plan for systematic change within Atlantic Airways. It includes mandatory bias training, revamped hiring practices, clear accountability measures, and a complete overhaul of our customer complaint system." The board members exchanged glances. The proposal was ambitious and expensive. "This will cost millions to implement," Patricia pointed out. "And doing nothing will cost us more," Sarah countered. "Not just in potential lawsuits or bad publicity, but in human capital. How many talented employees have we lost because of this culture? How many customers have quietly taken their business elsewhere?" Karen sat silently, watching her career potentially unravel before her eyes. But then Sarah did something unexpected. "Ms. Miller, I don't want your resignation," she said. "I want your help. You're not the problem, you're a symptom of a larger issue. And you can be part of the solution." The room fell silent again, but this time it was different. It was the silence of possibility, of change in the making. "I propose we establish a Diversity and Inclusion Council," Sarah continued. "And I want Ms. Miller to be one of its first members. Sometimes the best advocates for change are those who've been part of the problem and have learned from it." Karen looked up, tears in her eyes. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll help us do better," Sarah replied simply. The board meeting continued for several more hours, diving deep into the specifics of Sarah's proposal. By the end, they had unanimously approved the most comprehensive diversity and inclusion initiative in the company's history. As the meeting concluded, Karen approached Sarah. "Ms. Johnson, I am so deeply sorry." "I know," Sarah interrupted gently. "But sorry isn't enough. We need action. Are you ready to be part of that action?" Karen nodded, understanding that she was being offered not just forgiveness, but an opportunity for redemption. As the boardroom emptied, Sarah remained behind, looking out at the city below. The real work was just beginning. Change wouldn't happen overnight. But today they had taken the first crucial step. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, "Extraordinary meeting. The press will want to talk about this." Sarah smiled and typed back, "Let them. It's time we had this conversation openly." The sun was setting over Manhattan, casting long shadows across the boardroom. Tomorrow, the real work would begin, the hard, necessary work of transforming not just a company, but an industry's culture. 6 months had passed since the pivotal board meeting, and Atlantic Airways was in the midst of its most significant organizational change in its 50-year history. Sarah Johnson's office had become the epicenter of this transformation, with its walls covered in charts tracking progress and implementation timelines. "The numbers are encouraging," Sarah explained to the newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Council. Karen Miller sat among the council members, her presence a testament to the company's commitment to redemption and growth. Passenger complaints related to discrimination have decreased by 47% since we implemented the new training programs. The council meeting room buzzed with energy as representatives from various departments shared their updates. The changes were comprehensive and far-reaching. The Human Resources Department had overhauled their hiring practices, implementing blind resume screenings and diverse interview panels. Flight crew composition was being carefully monitored to ensure representation at all levels. Most significantly, a new anonymous reporting system had been established, allowing employees to flag discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation. Karen, who had initially struggled with her new role, had become one of the program's most passionate advocates. "I've been conducting workshops with our flight crews," she reported. "When I share my story, our story," she glanced at Sarah, "it really resonates. People are beginning to understand that these aren't just policy changes, they are about fundamental human dignity." The transformation wasn't without its challenges. Some long-time employees resisted the changes, claiming they were unnecessary or too extreme. Others left the company altogether. But for every departure, there were dozens of applications from professionals eager to join an airline that was becoming known for its progressive stance on inclusion. Media attention had been intense. Industry publications praised Atlantic Airways' bold approach, while some critics accused them of virtue signaling. Sarah handled each interview with grace, consistently returning to the core message. This wasn't about public relations, it was about doing what was right. One afternoon, as Sarah reviewed the latest progress reports, her assistant announced an unexpected visitor. It was the elderly businessman who had nodded in agreement with Karen during the infamous flight. "Ms. Johnson," he began, clearly uncomfortable. "I've been following the changes you've implemented here. I wanted to apologize for my behavior that day. I was part of the problem, and I'm here to learn how to be part of the solution." Sarah invited him to sit down, and they had a long, honest conversation about privilege, bias, and the small moments that shape corporate culture. By the end, he had pledged his company's support for Atlantic Airways' new initiatives and offered to share their training programs with his own organization. The transformation extended beyond the company's walls. Other airlines began reaching out, seeking guidance on implementing similar programs. Sarah found herself speaking at industry conferences, sharing Atlantic Airways' journey and the lessons learned along the way. One particularly meaningful change came in the form of a mentorship program. Karen, drawing from her own experience, had suggested pairing senior staff with employees from underrepresented groups. The program quickly became one of the company's most successful initiatives. "We're not just changing policies," Sarah explained during a CNN interview. "We're changing hearts and minds. That's harder, slower work, but it's the only way to create lasting change." The impact was becoming visible in subtle but significant ways. Passenger surveys showed higher satisfaction rates across all demographics. Employee retention improved, particularly among minority staff members. The company's stock price had initially dipped when the changes were announced but had since recovered and surpassed its previous levels. During a quarterly board meeting, Marcus Chen presented the latest financial results. "Our bold stance on inclusion hasn't just been morally right," he announced, "it's been good for business. Our market share has increased by 12%, and we're seeing particular growth among younger, socially conscious travelers." Sarah sat back, listening to the positive reports. But she knew their work was far from complete. Real change required constant vigilance and commitment. She thought back to that day in first class. How one moment of discrimination had sparked a movement that was now reshaping an entire industry. As the meeting concluded, Karen approached her with a proposal. "I think it's time we took this to the next level," she said, presenting a plan for an industry-wide coalition on diversity and inclusion. "Other airlines are asking for our help. We could create standards that would affect millions of travelers." Sarah smiled, remembering how far they'd come from that confrontational day in the boardroom. "Draft the proposal," she said. "Let's show the world what real change looks like." 1 year to the day after the incident that sparked it all, Sarah Johnson found herself once again at JFK's Terminal 4, preparing to board a flight to Los Angeles. This time, however, she wasn't traveling incognito. Dressed in a tailored suit, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had transformed an industry. The changes were immediately apparent. The gate area displayed Atlantic Airways' new diversity pledge in multiple languages. The gate agents, representing a spectrum of backgrounds, handled passengers with practiced cultural sensitivity. A young black girl pointed excitedly at Sarah's picture on the wall, part of the company's Leaders in Flight campaign. "That's the lady who changed everything, Mommy," the girl exclaimed. Sarah smiled, remembering her own childhood dreams of aviation. As she approached the gate, Sarah noticed Karen Miller in her supervisor's uniform, conducting a pre-flight briefing with her crew. Their eyes met, and both women shared a knowing look. This was the same flight, the same route, but everything was different. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Johnson," Karen said warmly. This time with genuine respect and friendship. The first-class cabin now reflected the diversity of their passenger base, both in its crew and travelers. During the flight, Sarah observed the transformed service culture in action. The crew handled a situation with a passenger requiring religious accommodation smoothly, following the new protocols developed under their initiative. A flight attendant spoke in sign language to a deaf passenger, one of the many new skills emphasized in their enhanced training program. Mid-flight, Karen took her break and sat beside Sarah. "Sometimes I can hardly believe how much has changed," she reflected. "Yesterday, I trained a new hire who specifically joined Atlantic Airways because of our inclusion reputation." Sarah nodded. "Change creates more change. That's what makes it powerful." The conversation was interrupted by an announcement. Atlantic Airways had just been named Most Progressive Airline by Aviation Weekly, specifically citing their industry-leading diversity initiatives. The cabin erupted in applause as they began their descent into Los Angeles. Sarah reviewed some documents for tomorrow's industry summit. Atlantic Airways was launching an unprecedented partnership with 5 other major airlines to standardize inclusive practices across the industry. The Sky Equality Initiative would affect millions of passengers worldwide. After landing, Sarah stayed behind to speak with the crew. Each had a story about how the changes had affected them personally. A hijab-wearing flight attendant shared how she no longer feared wearing her religious garments to work. A gay purser described feeling comfortable being out at work for the first time in his career. In the terminal, Sarah spotted a familiar face, the elderly businessman from the original flight. He was now wearing an Atlantic Airways Diversity Champion pin and leading a group of corporate travelers in a discussion about inclusive business practices. "Ms. Johnson," he called out, "your program has transformed my entire company. We've implemented similar changes across our global offices. The ripple effect is remarkable." Later that evening, at a ceremony celebrating Atlantic Airways' recent award, Sarah stood at the podium, looking out at the gathered crowd. She saw Karen sitting with her diverse crew, all wearing the new uniform pins that read, "Dignity in Flight." She saw board members who had initially questioned the cost of these changes now proudly showcasing their results. She saw young aviation students from underrepresented backgrounds, they're on the company's new scholarship program. A year ago, Sarah began her speech. A moment of discrimination became a catalyst for change. But the real story isn't about that moment. It's about what happens when we choose to transform pain into progress. When we decide that good enough isn't good enough anymore. She paused, looking at Karen, who nodded encouragingly. Today, we're not just celebrating an award. We're celebrating the possibility of change. We're proving that inclusion isn't just a buzzword, it's a business imperative and a moral obligation. And we're showing that sometimes the most powerful changes start with a single moment of courage to stand up and say, "This needs to be better." As applause filled the room, Sarah thought about that first-class seat a year ago. She realized that sometimes the best view isn't from a window seat at 35,000 feet, it's from the vantage point of positive change. Watching as ripples of transformation spread far beyond what you ever imagined possible. The story of Atlantic Airways had become more than a corporate turnaround. It was a testament to the power of confronting bias with grace, meeting ignorance with education, and transforming adversity into opportunity. As Sarah looked out at the faces in the crowd, she knew that this wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning of a new chapter in aviation history.